Lyra had the escape timed down to the second. She knew exactly how long it took the Elder's procession to move from the preparation hall to the courtyard entrance, 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She knew the gap between the final horn call and the moment every eye in the crowd turned toward the altar, roughly 8 seconds of collective distraction. She knew the low stone wall behind the third pillar on the left side of the Thornvale courtyard was exactly waist height, and that the forest began 40 feet beyond it, and that 40 feet, for someone who had been running drills in secret every evening for the past 3 weeks, was nothing. She had planned this the way other girls her age planned weddings. Carefully, completely, with obsessive attention to every detail that could go wrong. Her name was Lyra Ashwood. She was 23 years old, the only daughter of a Beta family that had once held a respected place in the Dravith Pack, and now held mostly silence and careful invisibility. Her father, Owen Ashwood, had made a mistake 6 years ago, a political mistake, the kind that did not involve dishonesty or cruelty, but simply the wrong allegiance at the wrong moment, and the family had never quite recovered from the shadow it cast. They were not punished, they were not exiled. They were simply no longer important, and in a pack structured the way the Dravith Pack was structured, that was its own kind of sentence. Lyra had grown up watching her mother adjust to smallness, watching her father carry the weight of a mistake with the particular dignity of a man who refused to complain about a consequence he understood. She had grown up learning to be invisible when visibility was dangerous, and quiet when silence was safer than speech, and grateful, always, relentlessly, outwardly grateful, for whatever scraps of consideration came her family's way. She was very tired of being grateful. The mate bond had appeared on the morning of the last full moon, 6 weeks before the ceremony date. Lyra had been in the eastern field behind the Ashwood property, running her usual dawn drills, when it happened. A pull, a warmth, a sudden and absolute certainty, dropping into her chest like a stone into still water, that somewhere in the territory of the Dravith Pack, there was a person her body and her wolf had decided was hers. She had stood very still in the dewy grass for a long moment. Then she had gone inside, eaten breakfast, and told no one. She figured she had maybe 3 days before the bond was confirmed from the other side and the official notifications began. She used those 3 days to think, not to feel, not to dream, not to indulge in the particular fantasy that most unmated women in the pack entertained privately, the idea that the bond was something beautiful, something chosen, something that would arrive like a gift and be received with joy. She thought about what it actually meant. The other end of her bond was the king, Kalen Dravith, Alpha King of the Northern Packs, 31 years old, unmarried, with a reputation for cold precision and an inner circle that functioned more like a military unit than a court. He had taken the throne at 24 after his father's death, had consolidated 3 fractured territories into one functioning kingdom in the years that followed, and had done so with a level of strategic intelligence that people admired openly and feared quietly. Lyra did not know him. She had seen him twice, once at a territory gathering when she was 17, where he had stood at the head of a long table and spoken for 40 minutes without notes about border policy, and once at his father's public memorial when she was 18, where he had stood very straight and very still, and shown nothing at all on his face for the entire ceremony. Both times, she had thought, that is a man who has decided exactly what he is going to be, and arranged his entire life around that decision. Both times, she had thought, I would disappear inside a life like that. She was not wrong to think it. She was certain of that much. The bond notification came on the 4th day, carried by a runner from the palace in the careful formal language the pack used for these announcements. The elder was to be notified, the family was to be honored, the ceremony was to be held on the bonding moon, 6 weeks hence, in the Thornvale courtyard. It was not a request. Her mother cried with happiness. Her father embraced her with a kind of stunned relief that broke her heart quietly, because she understood what he was feeling, the sense that the family's long era of smallness might finally be over, that his daughter was going to carry them all back into the light. She did not tell them what she was planning. She told them she was honored. She told them she was grateful. She used the word grateful 4 more times in the following week, in 4 different conversations, and each time it sat in her mouth like something that did not belong there. She ran her drills in the eastern field. She memorized the courtyard layout. She identified the gap in the ceremony schedule. She packed a small bag, nothing ceremonial, nothing that belonged to the role she was being assigned, and she hid it in the hollow at the base of the oak tree 300 yards into the forest, at a point she could reach in under 2 minutes from the stone wall if she was moving fast. She was always moving fast. The morning of the ceremony, her mother dressed her in the white ceremonial gown. It was beautiful, genuinely, objectively beautiful, the kind of dress that existed to make a statement. Lyra stood in front of the mirror and looked at the girl in the white dress and felt something she had no clean word for. Not sadness exactly, not fear. Something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a decision and knowing that once you move, there is no version of events in which everything stays the same. She moved. The courtyard was everything it was supposed to be. The sky above the Thornvale had gone the color of embers, deep orange at the horizon, shading up through amber to a blue so dark it was almost black, with the bonding moon sitting fat and silver in the center of it. 300 wolves stood in the formal arrangement, dressed in pack colors, arranged by rank along the courtyard perimeter. The elder waited at the altar with his staff, and his certainty, and his particular way of standing, that suggested the universe had organized itself for his convenience. Kalen Draveth stood at the altar in a black ceremonial coat with silver at the collar. He was, she noticed, even from a distance, very still. Not the stillness of nervousness, the stillness of a man who had decided there was no point in fidgeting. The procession horn sounded. The crowd turned toward the altar. Lyra turned left. She lifted the hem of the white dress with both hands, cleared the low stone wall in one motion, and ran. The forest received her like something that had been waiting. The trees closed behind her immediately, the courtyard sounds muffling within seconds, and she pushed hard, arms pumping, feet finding the soft ground between the roots, her breath coming in sharp even pulls the way it did when she was running drills and not running away from the most significant ceremony of her pack season. The bag was in the hollow where she'd left it. She grabbed it without breaking stride, slung it over one shoulder, and kept moving north. Behind her, after exactly 4 seconds of silence, the courtyard found its voice. She could hear it even through the trees, not individual words, just the collective sound of 300 people absorbing something they had not expected. Then the horn again. Not ceremonial this time, but sharp and urgent, the kind of tone that meant something had gone wrong with the schedule. She pushed harder. The forest was dark and dense and familiar. She had run these paths every evening for 3 weeks, learning every route and dip and turn until she could do it by feel. She knew the creek crossing at the 40-yard mark. She knew the slope upward past the old lightning split oak. She knew that the forest opened briefly at the top of the rise before dropping back down into the deep pines, and that from that opening you could see the western edge of the territory, and beyond it the unmarked land that belonged to no pack. She was going to cross that line. She was going to step out of the life that had been arranged for her and into the open uncertainty of the unmapped world beyond, and she was going to do it in a white ceremonial dress with a small bag of practical clothing, and exactly 43 coins she had saved in the hidden pocket of her winter coat over the past 11 months. She was going to do it alone. She reached the top of the rise and stopped. Not because she wanted to stop, not because she had changed her mind. She stopped because there was someone sitting at the base of the lightning split oak, in the dark, in a black coat with silver at the collar, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who had been there long enough to get comfortable. Kalen Draveth looked up. "You chose the north path," he said. "I would have taken the east." Lyra's bag slipped off her shoulder. She did not bend to pick it up. "How?" she said. It was not a complete sentence. It did not need to be. He had the bonding cord in his hands, the ceremonial cord that should have been in the elder's hands at the altar, that should have been the formal instrument of a ceremony she had just fled. He turned it once around his left wrist, not binding it, just holding it. "You had been running this path every evening for 3 weeks, he said. "My eastern perimeter patrols noticed. I asked them not to say anything." She stared at him. "You knew," she said. "You knew I was planning to leave." "I suspected you were planning something," he said. "I wasn't certain it was leaving until you turned left." The courtyard sounds had faded entirely now. Up here on the rise, the world was very quiet. The bonding moon threw silver light across the clearing, and the old oak cast its split shadow in 2 directions, and Kalen Draveth sat at the base of it and waited with the patience of someone who had decided, somewhere between the altar and this moment, that waiting was the correct thing to do. "You're not going to drag me back," Lyra said. It came out as half a statement and half a question, because she genuinely was not certain. "No," he said. "You're not going to command me." He looked at her steadily. "No." She picked up her bag. She held it against her chest like a shield. She stood at the edge of the tree line with the open western territory visible over her shoulder, and a king sitting in the moonlight in front of her, and she tried to figure out what her next move was supposed to be. "Then what are you doing here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The cord turned once more around his wrist. "The bond chose you," he said. "I didn't. You didn't. Neither of us was consulted." He looked up and his eyes in the moonlight were a dark gray she had not been close enough to notice before. I would like to know who you are before I ask you for anything. That seems like a reasonable place to start. Lyra had prepared for many things. She had not prepared for this. You were at the altar, she said. 300 people were watching. You left. I left, he agreed. Your elder is going to have opinions about that. He has opinions about everything, Kaelin said. It hasn't been a problem so far. Despite herself, despite the bag clutched against her chest and the bag of 43 coins and 3 weeks of planning and 11 months of quiet accumulation of intent, Lyra felt the corner of her mouth move in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. She did not run. She did not step across the western boundary. She stood at the edge of the tree line in her white ceremony dress in the moonlight and looked at the king who had come after her without guards, without commands, without demands, and sat down at the base of a split oak to wait and see what she would do. She came away from the tree line, slowly. Not all the way. She stopped 10 feet from where he was sitting, which felt like a manageable distance. If I say I want to hear what you have to say, she said carefully, that is not the same thing as agreeing to go back. I know the difference, he said. She sat down on a root. Not on the log beside him, on a root, at a distance that made clear she had chosen her own spot, and not been assigned one. He did not move closer. He said, tell me about the 11 months. She looked at him sharply. The patrols noticed you running 3 weeks ago, he said, but you have been planning longer than that. I would like to know what the last 11 months looked like for you. Lyra Ashwood looked at the king of the northern packs and made a decision that was, in its own way, as large as the decision she had made when she turned left at the ceremony. She told him, not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough that the night grew older around them while she spoke, and the bonding moon climbed higher and then began its slow descent, and the forest that had been her escape route became something else entirely. A place where 2 people sat in the dark and one of them finally said the things she had been carrying for 11 months, and the other one listened. Actually listened. She noticed that. She would keep noticing it, in the weeks and months that followed. But on that night, in that clearing, with her bag beside her, and the western boundary still visible over her shoulder if she wanted to look at it, she noticed it for the first time. He did not interrupt. He did not fix. He did not reach for the solution before she had finished stating the problem. He listened. When she stopped talking, the forest was very quiet. The moon had moved. Her hands, she noticed, had stopped holding the bag like a shield and were resting in her lap. The ceremony was never the point, Kaelin said. What was the point? He held out his left wrist. The cord caught the moonlight. He held it there, not pushing it toward her, not withdrawing it, just holding it at a distance that meant the choice was entirely hers. She looked at the cord for a long moment. She did not take it, not then, not that night, but she did not run. And in the mathematics of that particular situation, not running was its own kind of answer. The courtyard did not know what to do with the silence she left behind. For approximately 4 seconds, Commander Rael counted later, as a matter of personal interest. No one in the Thornvale courtyard made a sound. 300 wolves, the elder, the 4 commanders, the noble representatives, the house witnesses, and the 2 young scribes whose job was to record the ceremony for the official pack record. All of them stood in the amber and silver light of the bonding moon and looked at the empty space where Lyra Ashwood had been standing. Then the space where King Kaelin Draveth had been standing also became empty. And then everyone found their voices at once. Rael had been standing at the left edge of the altar platform, in his formal black as the king's first commander, positioned where he always stood during pack ceremonies, close enough to act if action was needed, far enough to be invisible if it was not. He had watched Lyra move. He had watched the small, precise calculation she made before she turned. Not panic, not impulse, something much more considered than either of those things. And he had thought, in the single second before she cleared the wall, that this was a woman who had thought about this particular move for a very long time. He had also watched the king. Kaelin had seen her go. Rael was certain of that. He had seen the direction of the king's attention shift, had seen the moment of recognition cross Kaelin's face. Not surprise, not anger, something more like the expression a man makes when a calculation he has been running comes back exactly as expected. Then Kaelin had set down the bonding cord and walked off the altar platform. Not toward the forest, not toward the wall she had cleared. He had walked toward the east side of the courtyard, collected his traveling coat from the guard post where he had apparently left it before the ceremony. Left it, which meant he had planned to need it, and disappeared into the trees on the eastern path. Rael had made a choice in that moment. He had turned to face the three commanders who were moving toward the western wall and said, in the quiet voice that carried exactly as far as he wanted it to, "Hold." Commander Petra stopped. Commander Wynne stopped. Commander Aldrich stopped, looked at Rael, and then looked at the elder, who was already moving toward them with his staff striking the courtyard stone in a rhythm that communicated his feelings without requiring any words. "The king is handling this," Rael said. "The king," the elder began, in the voice he used for important pronouncements, "has abandoned the ceremony to chase." "The king has left the ceremony," Rael said. "He hasn't asked for our assistance. I suggest we wait until he does." This was, technically speaking, insubordinate. Rael was aware of that. He was also aware that he had known Kaelin Draveth for 19 years, and that in those 19 years he had developed a fairly accurate sense of when the king was doing something deliberate, and when he was doing something impulsive. Kaelin was almost never impulsive. The code at the guard post had confirmed it. The elder was not finished. The elder, in Rael's experience, was never finished. "This is an insult to the crown," he said, raising his voice in a way that ensured the nearest 100 witnesses could hear clearly. "That girl has disgraced." "Elder." Rael used the quieter version of his command voice, which was, if anything, more effective than the loud version. "The king made no instruction before he left. In the absence of instruction, the pact does not act. That is law, and it is also common sense." This was partially true. The law was somewhat more complicated than that summary suggested, but the elder had the grace to hesitate, which was all Rael needed. He turned to face the courtyard. 300 wolves were still standing in their formal positions, which said something either about their discipline or about their uncertainty. The air had the particular quality of a situation that was not sure yet what it was going to be. Not danger exactly, but the feeling just before a determination is made. "The ceremony is postponed," Rael said, clearly, loudly enough for all 300 to hear. "The king's announcement will follow in due course. Please return to your homes and await word from the palace." This was not an official declaration. Rael did not have the authority to make official declarations on the king's behalf without a formal proxy appointment. He was aware of this. He said it anyway. And it worked, because authority is often less about the formal appointment and more about the quality of certainty with which a statement is delivered. People began to move, slowly at first, in small clusters of 2 and 3, the formal arrangements dissolving into the informal motion of individuals deciding to leave. The noble representatives exchanged looks that contained entire conversations. The house witnesses began gathering their record books. The 2 young scribes, who had written nothing at all during the ceremony because there had been nothing ceremonial to record, capped their ink and left with the relieved expressions of people who had narrowly avoided an impossible documentation problem. The elder stood his ground for another 40 seconds, which was long enough to make his displeasure visible to anyone still watching, and then moved toward the preparation hall with the dignified pace of a man who had not been defeated, but was choosing to regroup. Petra came to stand beside Rael. She was the second commander, older than him by 4 years, steadier than him by a disposition Rael had always quietly admired, and she had the habit of saying exactly what she observed without decoration. "He went east," she said. "Yes." The girl went west. "Yes." "He knows something we don't." Rael watched the last of the witnesses filtering out of the courtyard. The moon was high and clear. The thorn veil looked like something out of a formal painting, all pale stone and shadow and the remnant warmth of ceremony lanterns burning down. "He usually does," Rael said. Petra was quiet for a moment. "Should we follow?" Rael thought about the coat at the guard post. He thought about the expression he had seen cross the king's face in the moment before Lyra Ashwood cleared the wall. Not surprise, not anger, but a particular focus. The expression of a man beginning something. "No," he said. They waited. It was Aldrich who lost patience first, which was no surprise. Aldrich was the youngest of the 4 commanders, 26 to Rael's 32, and he wore his energy visibly in a way the others had long since learned to contain. He lasted approximately 40 minutes in the emptied courtyard before he began pacing the perimeter. "Someone should be out there," he said. He went alone, into the forest, at night. "He grew up in that forest," Rael said. "Same as the rest of us. He's the king. He's also the best tracker in the pack, as he would be happy to remind you if you suggested he needed someone to follow him into the woods." Aldrich opened his mouth and then closed it, which was the correct response to that observation. They waited for 3 more hours. The moon had crossed its peak and begun its long slide toward the western horizon, when Rael heard the sound he had been listening for. 2 sets of footsteps on the forest path, moving without urgency. He turned. Kalen came out of the trees first, in his traveling coat, the bonding cord still wound once around his left wrist. He looked exactly as composed as he had looked standing at the altar 3 hours ago, which was either impressive or slightly inhuman, depending on your perspective on the king's general relationship with visible emotion. Lyra Ashwood came out of the trees 2 steps behind him. She was still in the white ceremony dress, which was now adorned with approximately what you would expect a white ceremony dress to accumulate after 3 hours in a forest: some mud at the hem, a small tear at the left shoulder where she had apparently caught it on something, a pine needle caught in her hair above her left ear. She was carrying a bag. She looked, Rael thought, like a woman who had made several significant decisions in the past few hours, and had not entirely finished processing all of them. She was not, notably, being escorted. She was not walking behind the king or being guided in any way that suggested she had been brought back rather than accompanied. She was walking beside him, slightly behind, with the distance and bearing of someone who had chosen her own position. Aldrich made a sound. Rael stepped on his foot. Kalen surveyed the 4 of them with the glance he used when he was taking inventory. "The courtyard is clear," he said. It was not a question. "Dismissed everyone approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes ago," Rael said. "The elder?" "Return to the preparation hall. He has opinions." "He has opinions about everything," Kalen said. "We'll address them tomorrow." He turned to Lyra. "The East Wing has guest quarters that are separate from the formal visitor apartments. They have their own entrance from the garden and their own kitchen access. You can use those for now, until we have worked out what the next steps look like." This was, Rael noted, addressed to her directly, not announced to the commanders with her as a given. Addressed to her. Lyra looked at the king for a moment. "For now," she repeated. "Until we work out what comes next," he said, "which is not tonight." She considered this. She looked at the bag in her hands. She looked at the 4 commanders, who were working with varying degrees of success to appear as though they were not intensely interested in everything she said. Her gaze moved to Rael, held there for a second, assessing, he thought, and accurate in the assessment, and then returned to Kalen. "Separate entrance," she said. "Yes. I can come and go." "Yes." Another pause. "All right," she said. Not warmly, not with relief, but with the measured quality of a practical person accepting practical terms. "All right." She followed Kalen toward the palace. Rael watched them go. Petra appeared at his shoulder. "That was not what I expected," she said. "No," Rael agreed. "What was it exactly?" Rael thought about this for a moment. He watched the king and the girl in the white dress disappear through the garden entrance. He thought about the coat left at the guard post, about the eastern path, about the expression he had seen on Kalen's face at the moment of departure. "I think," he said carefully, "that it was the beginning of a negotiation." Petra absorbed this, between the king and his mate. Between 2 people who do not know each other and have both decided they would like to change that before they agree to anything. That's not how mate bonds usually work. "No," Rael said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Aldrich and Wynne had begun the walk back toward the palace, still exchanging in low tones the particular kind of conversation that consists mostly of one person saying they cannot believe what just happened, and the other person agreeing. The courtyard was empty. The bonding moon was nearly at the horizon. "How does the elder handle it?" Petra asked. "Poorly," Rael said, "but that's what we're here for." They began the walk back. The palace that evening had the quality of a held breath. The staff moved with the careful efficiency of people who understood that something significant had occurred and had not yet been fully classified. The guard rotation happened on schedule because Rael made certain of it. The kitchen prepared a late meal because he made certain of that too, ensuring that the tray sent to the East Wing guest quarters was simple and substantial, and arrived without fanfare or ceremony. The elder's formal written complaint arrived at Rael's office before midnight. It was 4 pages long and referenced 7 distinct points of pack law. Rael read all 4 pages, confirmed that the elder had in fact correctly cited all 7 legal points, and set it on the corner of his desk. He would show it to the king in the morning. In the morning, the real difficulty would begin, not with Lyra, not with the bond, not even with the elder's 7 legal points. The real difficulty would come from the border lords and the noble houses, who had witnessed the ceremony, or witnessed its absence, and who would need to form an opinion about what had happened, and would form it whether or not anyone provided them with accurate information. Rael knew from experience that the less accurate information you provided, the more creatively people invented their own. He drafted a brief statement, 3 sentences, factual, containing no interpretation, and sent it to the palace communication staff for distribution in the morning. The king had postponed the ceremony. The king and his intended mate were both well and in residence. Further announcements would follow. 3 sentences. Nothing about the forest. Nothing about the bag. Nothing about the east wing entrance with its separate kitchen access and its careful, practical terms. That part was not the kingdom's business. Not yet. Rael went to his window and looked out at the dark courtyard. The lanterns had burned down. The Thornvale was pale stone in the moonless dark, and the forest beyond was a wall of black, and the night had the particular quality of a night that had started as one thing and finished as something else entirely, without anyone quite agreeing on a definition. He heard, distantly, the sound of a door in the east wing opening and closing. Someone using the separate entrance. Coming or going, he could not tell. He did not try to find out. The East Wing guest quarters had a window that faced the garden, and every morning for the first week Lyra sat on the wide stone sill before dawn and watched the light come into the sky. She was not sleeping well. This was not a crisis. She had periods in her life where sleep came reluctantly, and she had long ago learned not to fight them. She lay in the dark, organized her thoughts, and when the organizing produced enough restlessness she got up and sat by the window and watched the garden until the dark became gray, and the gray became the particular pale gold of early morning and late autumn. She was trying to understand where she was, not physically. Physically, she was in the east wing of the Draveth Palace, in a room that was more comfortable than any room she had lived in before, but not in a way that felt showy about it. Good mattress, real wooden furniture, a fireplace that drew cleanly, a bathroom with actual hot water piped in from somewhere she had not yet investigated. Comfortable in a practical way. The way a room is comfortable when someone has thought about what makes living in it easy rather than what makes it look impressive. She was trying to understand where she was in the larger sense. She had not crossed the western boundary. She had not used the 43 coins. She had not worn any of the practical clothes in the bag she had packed so carefully. She had returned to the palace in the white ceremony dress, now washed and hanging in the wardrobe because the palace laundry staff had appeared to collect it with the quiet efficiency of people who did not ask questions and were paid precisely for that quality, and she had been here for 7 days. She was not sure what she was doing here. No, that was not quite accurate. She knew some of what she was doing here. She was figuring out whether the thing that had happened in the clearing on the night of the ceremony was what it had appeared to be, or whether it was something more complicated that had appeared simple in the moonlight. The thing that had happened, a king had come after her without command, without force, without the arsenal of authority he could have deployed, and had sat in the dark and waited to see what she would do. He had asked her to talk. He had listened when she talked. He had offered, at the end, not a demand or an ultimatum or even a request in the formal sense, but a choice. The cord around his wrist, held out at a distance that made the refusal easy, the acceptance entirely hers. She had not taken it. She had come back to the palace. She was working out whether those two things meant the same thing or different things. On the third morning, she dressed in the most practical clothes she had brought and went looking for the kitchen. She found it after 2 wrong turns. The east wing's layout was not complicated, but she had not yet memorized it, and stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at a space that was clearly not the main palace kitchen, but was a smaller, functional version of one. A kettle was already heating on the small stove. A covered plate sat on the table. There was a note under the corner of the plate. She unfolded it. It was short. 4 lines of neat, contained handwriting. It said, "Morning briefings happen at 6:30. You don't need to come. But the door is open if you want to." She looked at the note for a long moment. Then she looked at the window, which showed a sky that was just beginning to lighten. She looked at the plate, which when she uncovered it, contained what appeared to be a very reasonable breakfast. She ate the breakfast, drank the tea she made from the kettle, and folded the note into a precise square and put it in the pocket of her jacket. She went to the morning briefing. It was held in a long room on the 2nd level of the main palace wing, a room that had the feeling of a place used for working rather than for performing. No formal arrangement, no raised platform, no ceremonial seating, a long table covered with maps and documents, 6 chairs arranged without hierarchy, and 5 people already seated when she walked in, the king and his 4 commanders. She stopped at the door. Kaelin looked up. "There's coffee," he said, "and the Northern Supply Report is on top if you want something to read while Aldrich finishes his summary." She came in. She poured coffee. She sat in the empty chair at the end of the table, not at his right hand, not close, the end, and picked up the Northern Supply Report. Aldrich was 26 and currently presenting something about the timber allocation in the western provinces that appeared to contain a mathematical error. Lyra noticed the error on the 3rd line of the summary she was reading, checked it against the figures in the appendix, confirmed it, and then looked up. "The transport cost in column 4 is wrong," she said. Everyone at the table looked at her. Aldrich looked at the document, looked at it more carefully. looked at Rael, who was looking at the document with an expression of someone who has also just noticed the error, and is grateful someone else said it first. It is, Aldrich said. That changes the total allocation by 84 coins per unit, Lyra said, which across the 12 Western stations is just over 1,000 coins per quarter, which is probably why the Western station commanders have been submitting supplemental requests. There was a silence. Kaylin was watching her with the expression she had begun to recognize, contained, attentive, giving nothing away except the attentiveness itself. The supplemental requests have been coming in for 3 quarters, he said. So the error has been in the allocation model for at least 9 months, she said. Possibly longer if this quarter's report was built on last quarter's figures. Wynne, Kaylin said. Wynne, the third commander, was already reaching for the previous quarter's document. The briefing continued for another hour. Lyra sat at the end of the table and read and occasionally said things, and each time she said something the quality of the room shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not with the fanfare of surprise, but with the small adjustment of people recalibrating their sense of a situation. She was not performing competence. She genuinely found the supply chain problem interesting. She found the Border Patrol report interesting. She found the water rights dispute between 2 eastern villages interesting in a completely different way, because it was less a resource problem and more a communication problem, and she said so. The villages are not fighting over water, she said. They are fighting about who gets to decide. The water is the current argument, but it is not the actual argument. If you arbitrate the water, you solve nothing. You need someone to sit with both village elders and address the question of decision-making authority. Then the water resolves itself. The table was quiet. Rael said mildly, "That is probably the most accurate read of that situation I have heard." She looked at him. He was watching her with a kind of careful openness she found easier to trust than enthusiasm would have been. "My father spent 3 years arbitrating village disputes in the Eastern Territory," she said. "I used to go with him." "Before," Wynne started, and then stopped. "Before the difficulty," Lyra said evenly. "Yes." She used her father's word for it. Difficulty, not mistake, not disgrace, not the more colorful terms the pack had used at the time. Difficulty, a word that acknowledged the weight of something without making it the only thing. No one at the table pressed further. The briefing ended at 8:30. People gathered documents, exchanged brief references to tasks they were taking away, and moved toward the door. Aldrich paused beside Lyra on his way out. He had the slightly abashed expression of a 26-year-old who has had a calculation error pointed out in front of the king. "The column 4 thing," he said. "An easy thing to miss," she said. "I should have caught it." "Yes," she said, "but it's been running through unchecked for 3 quarters, which means 4 people before you also didn't catch it. It's a modeling problem, not a carelessness problem. The column heading is ambiguous." He considered this. "I could fix the heading and run the corrected model back through the previous 3 quarters data." "Yes," she said. "That would tell you exactly how much the Western stations have been underfunded, and give you a real number to work with for the supplemental requests." He nodded slowly. "Right." He paused. "You're good at this." She didn't respond to that. She was already looking at the water rights document she had picked up from the table, because there was a section on the 3rd page she had not had time to read. She heard him leave. She heard, after a moment, that there was still one person in the room. She looked up. Kaylin was at the window, looking out at the garden below. He had his hands behind his back. He was in his working clothes, not ceremony clothes, not the formal coat, just dark trousers and a plain shirt, the silver collar missing, and he looked like a person rather than a king, which she had found was an almost jarring distinction she was still adjusting to. "You don't have to come to these," he said, still looking at the garden. "You said that in the note." "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. "I came because I wanted to." He turned from the window, looked at her. "All right," he said. She looked back at the document. "The water rights issue. Can I read the full file?" "Rael has it. I'll ask him to send it to the East Wing." She nodded. Then, before she could stop herself, "Why did you go east?" He looked at her. "The night of the ceremony. I went west." "You knew I went west. You said you knew I'd probably take the north path, but you went east and came around, which takes longer. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the pale autumn sun was doing its best. "Because coming around the long way meant arriving before you did," he said. "And arriving before you did meant you had to decide whether to pass me or stop." He paused. "If I had followed you directly, you would have felt followed. That was not the situation I wanted." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. "You wanted me to choose to stop," she said. "Yes." rather than stopping because you blocked the path. Yes. She thought about this, about the cord around his wrist in the moonlight, about the way he had held it out, at a distance, no pressure, the acceptance entirely hers. That was calculated, she said. Yes, he said. He didn't apologize for it. She nodded once, slowly. All right, she said. She tucked the water rights document under her arm and left. The day that followed had a different quality than the days before it. She spent 2 hours in the small library off the East Wing, reading everything she could find about the Eastern water rights dispute, which turned out to be a long, layered disagreement that went back 4 generations and had been addressed by 3 different kings with 3 different approaches, none of which had worked. By noon, she had a clear picture of why none of them had worked, and a rough sketch of what might. She wrote it up, 3 pages, clear language, no decoration. She set it on the table in the East Wing kitchen. By the next morning it was gone. By the afternoon of the day after that, Rael appeared at the East Wing garden entrance and knocked. She opened the door. He was holding the 3 pages and had written in the margins of 2 of them. The second approach failed for a different reason than you identified, he said, without preamble. There was a drought year. The water volume was the problem that season, not the authority structure. I didn't know about the drought year, she said. The historical record is patchy. He handed the pages back to her. They had not been returned. They had been annotated. The distinction mattered. The relevant archive is in the main library, 3rd level, eastern section. The drought records are misfiled under climate reports instead of territory history. A pause, worth knowing. She took the pages, looked at the annotations, looked at him. He was the kind of man she found it easy to read, not because he was transparent, but because he was precise. He said what he meant. He did not add warmth he did not feel, but he also did not subtract the warmth he did. Thank you, she said. The king read it this morning, Rael said, turning to go. He said it over his shoulder, easily, as though it were a small addition rather than the main point. He asked me to tell you it was the most useful analysis of that situation he has seen. He went back through the garden. Lyra stood in the doorway and looked at the annotated pages. She had come back from the forest in a white ceremony dress and sat in the East Wing for 7 days trying to figure out where she was. She had sat on the windowsill before dawn every morning watching the garden. She had eaten the breakfasts left under notes. She had gone to a morning briefing because a door was left open and she had chosen to walk through it. She was beginning to understand where she was. She was in the middle of something that did not have a category. Something that had started in a forest on the night of the ceremony and was now continuing in a way that looked like work and conversation and annotated documents and open doors, but was actually a question being asked in very slow, very careful increments. The question was whether 2 people who had not chosen each other could find a reason to do so. She went inside to revise the water rights analysis with the drought year factored in. The letter from Lord Harwick arrived on the 14th day. Rael brought it to the morning briefing in the way he brought all official correspondence. In the stack with everything else, no drama attached to the placement, the significance left to the content rather than the delivery. Kalen read it while Petra was presenting the Eastern Patrol adjustment, and when Petra finished he set the letter on the table and said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. Lyra had learned to read the silences. This one meant the letter had said something that required consideration before response, as opposed to the quick silence of someone processing logistics, or the particular flat silence that meant he already knew what to do and was deciding how to say it. Harwick, she said, reading the crest upside down from her position at the end of the table. Harwick, Kalen confirmed. He's the border lord who controls the Southwest Passage. She had read the territory files. She had read most of the territory files in the past 2 weeks, partly because they were interesting, and partly because she had been raised by a man who believed that understanding the shape of a situation was always worth the time. 300 soldiers in the garrison, treaty obligations that haven't been reviewed in 11 years. He sent a formal inquiry last spring about renewing the patrol agreement, and hadn't had a response. The table was briefly quiet in the way it sometimes became when she said something that contained more information than people had expected. He sent the inquiry to the wrong office, Wynne said. It went to the treaty archive instead of the border command. So he's been waiting 9 months for a response that was never going to come, Lyra said. And now he's heard about the ceremony and he has an opinion. Kalen looked at her. What do you think his opinion is? She considered. She had not read the letter. She was working from what she knew of Harwick's position. Southwest Passage, aging treaty, 9 months of silence from the palace, and now the spectacle of a bonding ceremony that had not been completed in the traditional way. He thinks you're distracted, she said. He thinks the bond business has created internal instability. He's testing whether the palace response time is still functional, or whether the 9 months of silence is the new norm. She paused. He's not hostile. He's cautious. There's a difference. Aelin was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the letter and passed it to her. She read it. It was 7 paragraphs, formally worded, and contained exactly what she had predicted. A polite but pointed inquiry about the status of the patrol agreement, a carefully indirect reference to recent events, and a closing paragraph that was, in diplomatic language, an offer of continued loyalty, contingent on continued communication. He wants to know if the palace is still paying attention, she said. Yes. He deserves an answer to the patrol inquiry before anything else, she said. That's the real issue. The ceremony reference is secondary. It's the context he's using to justify the urgency, but the actual problem is 9 months of feeling ignored. She set the letter down. Kaelin was watching her with that expression she had learned to read as close attention, not the expression of a man being surprised, but of a man confirming something he had been thinking. Write the response, he said. She looked at him. If you're willing, he said. The patrol inquiry response, draft it. She looked at the letter. She looked at the table. She was aware of 4 other people in the room, all of whom were managing their reactions to this with varying degrees of success. I don't represent the palace, she said. You don't need to. The response will go from the Border Command Office with Wynn's signature. You're drafting the substance. He paused. Unless you don't want to. She thought about the open door and the notes under breakfast plates and the annotated margins. She thought about the East Wing entrance with its separate key that she had been given, without being asked to give it back. I'll draft it, she said. She wrote it that afternoon. 2 pages, a direct acknowledgement of the original inquiry, a clear explanation of the misfiling, a proposed framework for the renewed patrol agreement, with 3 specific options ranked by logistical difficulty, and a closing that addressed the ceremony indirectly by being entirely businesslike about everything else. The message it sent was, the palace is functioning, the palace noticed the gap, and the palace is capable of producing coherent responses to legitimate concerns. Wynn read the draft that evening and made 4 small adjustments. He sent it under his signature the following morning. Harwick's reply came in 5 days. It was 2 paragraphs, warm, and confirmed the second patrol agreement option with an expression of appreciation for the clarity. Rael put the reply on the table at the next briefing without comment. Aldrich read it and made a sound that was not quite a word. Lyra did not look up from the Eastern trade document she was reading. The thing that had started with the column 4 error and continued through the water rights analysis and the Harwick letter became something that happened regularly, and then something that happened daily, and then something that the briefings organized themselves around without anyone formally making that decision. She had a chair, not an assigned chair, not a titled chair, just the chair at the end of the table where she always sat, which over time developed the particular claim that comes from consistent occupation. The elder noticed. Of course the elder noticed. The elder had 17 years of experience tracking the political atmosphere of the palace and the sensitivity of a man who understood that his authority rested on the formal structures of ceremony and law, both of which had been publicly bent on the night of the bonding moon. He came to the East Wing, not to her. He did not come to her. He went to the main wing and requested a formal audience with the king, and the king received him in the formal meeting room with Rael present, which was the combination the elder would have expected, and which meant the elder was given no opportunity to say anything that was not also being said in front of a witness. Rael summarized the meeting for Lyra 2 days later, in the corridor outside the main library, in the brief and precisely worded way he had of delivering information. The elder's position is that the bond requires formal completion through the traditional ceremony. He has 7 legal citations, all of which are accurate. He also believes that the current arrangement, your presence in the palace in an unofficial capacity, is damaging to the Crown's authority in a way that a completed ceremony would resolve. Lyra processed this. He's not wrong about the legal citations. No, Rael said, he's not. And he's probably not wrong about the authority concern either. The noble houses are talking. They are, Rael said, mostly to each other at this point, but the volume is increasing. She leaned against the corridor wall. Through the window to her left, the palace garden was bare and brown, the last of the autumn color gone. She had been here for 23 days. What does the king say? Rael was quiet for a moment. This was a different quiet than his usual precision. This was the quiet of someone deciding how much to say. He told the elder that the bonding cord is on his wrist, Rael said finally, and that when it moves to both wrists, it will move because both parties have decided that's what they want, not because the law requires it by a particular date. Lyra was quiet. The elder cited legal time frames, Rael said. There are formal windows for bond completion. The first is 30 days from the original ceremony date, which is in 7 days. She looked at the window, the garden, the bare brown branches. What happens if the window passes without completion? Formally, the elder has the authority to recommend a bond review, which would mean an assessment of whether the bond is being voluntarily denied by one or both parties, and whether PAC law requires intervention. Intervention being what exactly? Historically, it has never been applied to an Alpha King, Rael said. The legal question of whether the elder's review authority extends to the king is untested. She looked at him. The king is aware of all of this, Rael said. He asked me to make sure you were also aware of it. That is the sum total of his instruction on this matter. He did not ask me to advise you. He did not ask me to suggest anything. He asked me to make sure you had the information. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. 7 days. Not a demand, not a deadline presented as a demand. Information, delivered in a way that made clear the decision was hers. Thank you, she said. Rael nodded and went back toward the briefing room. She stood in the corridor for a while longer, looking at the bare garden. That evening, she went to the main wing for the first time since her arrival. Not to the briefing room, not to the library, to the working office on the second level where the king spent the hours between the evening meal and whatever time he eventually went to bed, reviewing correspondence and making the smaller decisions that accumulated across a day of larger ones. She knocked. Come in, he said. She came in. It was a working room in every sense. Shelves of documents, a desk covered with organized work, a fire that was functional rather than decorative. He was at the desk. He set down what he was reading. Rael told me, she said. I know. He waited. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, not the formal chair placed to one side for official meetings, but the plain chair directly across from him, the one that said she was there to have a conversation and not to be received. I have a question, she said. All right. If I said I needed more time, more than 7 days, if I said the 30-day window was going to pass and I was not yet ready to make this decision, what would you do? He looked at her. The fire crackled. Outside, the night wind moved through the garden trees. I would deal with the elder's review authority question, he said, which, as Rael told you, is legally untested, which means I have the stronger argument in the room. You would fight a legal challenge rather than pressure me. Yes, why? He was quiet for a moment, not the calculating quiet, a different quality, something more careful. Because the bond chose you, he said. It did not ask your permission. The ceremony chose a date that was not yours. The formal process chose a structure you did not design. He looked at the fire for a moment and then back at her. I am not willing to add my name to that list of things that happened to you without your consent. The room was very quiet. Lyra looked at the man across the desk. She had been here for 23 days. She had sat at the end of his briefing table and read his territory files and drafted a letter that had resolved a 9-month diplomatic irritation. She had eaten breakfast left under notes and walked through doors left open and found, repeatedly, that what appeared to be a situation with conditions attached was actually a situation in which the conditions had been left for her to name. She had been trying to understand where she was. She understood now. I don't need more time, she said. He looked at her. I need it to be different from the first ceremony, she said. I need to choose the date. I need to choose who's there. I need it to not be a performance for the PAC or the elder or the noble houses. If it's going to happen, it happens. Because we have decided it is what we want, both of us. Yes, he said. You're not going to argue for the traditional format. No. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. She stood up. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, not turning. 6 days, she said. Give me 6 days to figure out what I want it to look like. 6 days, he agreed. She left. Behind her, in the working office, the fire crackled on in the quiet. Lyra spent the first of her 6 days writing a list. She sat at the East Wing kitchen table with the kind of plain paper she used for analysis documents, not the formal correspondence paper, not the ceremonial vellum that had been sent to the room at some point by the palace staff, presumably in anticipation of thank you notes she had not written, and she wrote down everything she did not want. The list was long. She did not want 300 people. She did not want the Thornvale courtyard, which had become in her memory a place with a particular pressure attached to it, the memory of standing at the entrance in the white dress and making the calculation. She did not want the elder with his staff and his certainty. She did not want the formal arrangements of rank, the noble witnesses, the House representatives, the 2 scribes with their ink and their impossible documentation task. She did not want any element of the evening that felt like something being done to her rather than something she was doing. She looked at the list. Then she turned the paper over and started a second list, which was shorter. She wanted a morning, not an evening. The bonding moon was tradition, but it was the Pax tradition and the ceremony's tradition, and she was in the process of deciding that this particular event was going to be hers rather than the Pax. A gray November morning, something that asked nothing of the sky and got on with itself regardless. She wanted plain clothes, her own choice. She wanted the people she would choose, not many, but the right ones. She wanted to speak the words herself, rather than have them spoken over her by someone else. She wanted, she realized, writing it down slowly, the cord on both wrists, to mean the same thing it already meant on one. Because she had looked at Kalen Dravith across a desk in a firelit working office and heard him say that he would not add his name to the list of things that had happened to her without her consent, and she had understood in that moment something she should have understood sooner but had not been ready to. He was not the throne, he was not the ceremony, he was not the weight of the bond, or the elders' 7 legal citations, or the noble house's opinions, or the expectation that she should be grateful. He was a person who had come after her without commands, and sat in the dark, and waited. She had been treating the situation like a problem to solve. She had been analyzing it the way she analyzed supply chain errors and water rights disputes, looking for the logical shape of it, the categorical error, the decision point where things could go differently. She had not been treating it like a person. She had been treating him like a category rather than a person. This was not entirely her fault. She had spent 11 months preparing to escape a category, but it was something she needed to correct. On the second day, she sent a note to Rael asking for the complete files on the 2 eastern villages in the water rights dispute. Not because she was working on the case, her analysis was finished and had already gone to the border command, but because she had told him in the briefing that the issue was about decision-making authority, and she wanted to know if she had been right. Rael sent the files with a note that said, "You were right. Also, the villages have agreed to a joint council meeting. The water agreement is currently being drafted." She read this 3 times. Then she put the note in the same pocket as the first one, the one from under the breakfast plate. On the 3rd day, she went back to the main library and spent 4 hours in the 3rd-level eastern section, reading historical drought records that had been misfiled under climate reports. She found the relevant drought year. She also found in the same misfiled section records of 3 other disputes in the Eastern Territory that had been resolved or left unresolved in ways that suggested the misfiling was causing ongoing problems because the historical context was invisible to anyone working from the correctly filed records. She wrote a 2-page memo about the misfiling problem and its likely consequences, and left it on the library return desk, addressed to the head archivist. On the 4th day, Kalen found her in the library. She was in the middle of the 3rd-level eastern section, sitting on the floor, because there was no chair nearby and the documents she was working through required a flat surface, and she had arranged herself against the shelving with the relevant files in 2 stacks, and was deep enough into a disagreement about grazing boundaries from 40 years ago that she did not hear him approach. "The archivist received your memo," he said, from approximately 3 feet away. She did not jump. She had trained herself out of jumping. But she looked up with the expression of someone returning from a significant distance. "She found the filing error?" "She found," he said, carefully, "that the Eastern Territory climate and dispute records have been filed in the wrong location for approximately 60 years, because 2 archivists in the 1780s transposed the categories, and no one caught it until your memo." Lyra stared at him. 60 years. Every Eastern Territory dispute for 60 years has been cross-referenced to a category that doesn't match the filing location, he said. He sat down on the floor across from her, which she had not expected, and looked at the 2 stacks of documents. "How many unresolved cases are there?" "I've found 7, she said. "I think there may be more. I haven't reached the 1850s yet." He looked at the stacks. He looked at her. "How long have you been here today?" She glanced at the window. It was darker than she had realized. "Since this morning." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took the top document from the right-hand stack. He read the first page. He turned to the second page. He did not say anything for a moment, just read. And then he set the document on his knee and looked at the second stack and reached for the next one. Lyra watched him. They sat on the library floor for another hour. He read and she explained context, and they worked through the remaining files in the 1850s section and found 2 more misfiled dispute records. And by the end of it, they had a complete list of 9 cases covering 60 years of misfiled history. The library was quiet around them. The window had gone from dark gray to fully dark. The wall lanterns were lit and throwing warm light across the shelves and the floor and the two people sitting in the eastern section of the third level with a stack of 60-year-old documents between them. It will take months to correctly cross-reference all of this, Kalen said. He was looking at the list they had compiled between them, his handwriting and hers, alternating, across the top page. The archivist staff is good, Lyra said. If you give them the time and the instruction, they can do it systematically. The instruction from who? She looked at him. From whoever has the authority to redirect their work. He looked at the list, at the alternating handwriting. You could, he said. She was quiet. Not the authority of the throne, he said. Your own authority. You know this material better than anyone else in the palace right now. You found the problem. You know what the solution looks like. She looked at the list. It was a practical list. It was the kind of list that solved a real problem that had been causing real difficulties for 60 years. That is a different kind of question from the one I've been thinking about, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him. In the library lantern light, without the ceremony clothes or the formal coat, sitting on the floor of the third level with a stack of misfiled documents and their combined handwriting on a shared page, he looked like what he was, a person. Not a king exactly, not a category, not the abstract weight of the bond and the throne and the 30-day window. A person who had come to find her in the library and sat on the floor and spent an hour helping her solve a problem because the problem was interesting. She reached across the documents between them. She took his left hand. The bonding cord was there, as it had been since the night of the ceremony, wound once around his wrist. She held his hand for a moment, not doing anything, just holding it. He did not move. He did not speak. She brought her right wrist up beside his left. She looked at the cord. I have 2 more days, she said. Yes, he said. I know what I want the ceremony to look like. She did not let go of his hand. Small. Morning. Our words, not the elders. The people I choose. Yes, he said. Quietly. With the quality his voice had when he meant something. That's what I want, she said. I'm telling you now so you're not surprised when I tell you on day 6. He looked at the cord. He looked at her. I'm not surprised, he said. She let go of his hand. She stood up. She began gathering the documents into the correct stacks. He stood and helped her, and they returned the files to the shelves in the corrected order that would make sense once the archivist staff began their work. And when they left the library, they walked back toward the main wing without speaking and parted at the corridor junction where his route and hers diverged. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. She went back to the east wing. She sat on the windowsill and looked out at the garden, which was fully dark now. The bare trees black against a sky with the first stars showing between clouds. She had her 2 days. She did not particularly need them anymore, but she was going to use them anyway because she had learned that making a decision quickly and making a decision clearly were 2 different things, and the second was more important. On the 5th day, she went back to the briefing. After the briefing, she drafted the instruction memo for the archivist with the authority she had been offered, and the archivist received it and replied the same afternoon with a confirmation and a timetable for the reclassification work. On the 6th day, she wrote the invitations. Not formal invitations, plain paper, her handwriting, short notes. She wrote one to Rael, one to Petra, one to her parents, which was the longest of the notes and took 3 drafts because there was more to say there, more that needed to be navigated carefully. One to a woman named Claire who had been her closest friend since childhood and who had received the news of the ceremony, and the news of the escape, and the news of the subsequent radio silence with the steadiness of someone who knew better than to push. She did not write one to the elder. She left the invitations in the East Wing kitchen, where a palace runner collected them at noon. That evening she went to the working office and knocked. Come in, he said. She came in. She sat in the plain chair across from his desk. He set down his work. Tomorrow, she said. Morning. The Thornvale garden, not the courtyard, the garden side, where the gate opens to the forest. 6 people, including us. She paused. I want to wrap the cord myself. He looked at her. All right, he said. And I want to say what it means, she said. Not the formal words, my words. All right, he said. She looked at him across the desk, across the fire, across the distance that had been measured in careful increments since the night in the forest when she had sat on a root and told him about 11 months. I'm not doing this because of the window, she said. I want to be very clear about that. I know, he said. I'm doing it because I decided to, she said. I know, he said again. And he said it in the way that meant he had known for some time and had been waiting for her to arrive at the same place at her own pace. She stood up. She went to the door. She stopped. "The cord," she said. "Can I hold it tonight?" He unlooped it from his wrist. He held it out across the desk. She crossed the room, took it from his hand, and left. She sat on the windowsill for the last time that night, with the cord in her lap, and the garden below her, and the bare autumn trees and the stars between the clouds, and she thought about decisions and about the difference between things that happen to you and things you choose. In the morning she was going to choose. She was already sure. The morning came in gray and quiet, which was exactly what she had asked for. Lyra was dressed and waiting in the East Wing garden entrance at 7:45, which was 15 minutes before the time she had told people to arrive, which was 15 minutes before the time she had told Kaylin, because she needed those 15 minutes alone in the garden with the bare trees and the cold air, and the weight of the cord in her jacket pocket to confirm, one final time, what she already knew. She was sure. She had been sure since the library floor, if she was honest with herself. The library floor was where she had stopped treating a situation like a problem to be solved, and started treating it like what it was. The cord in her pocket was not a threat or a demand, or an obligation delivered by a system that hadn't asked her permission. It was something she had asked to hold the night before, and something a person had given her, and she had slept with it on the windowsill beside her, and woken up still knowing what she wanted. The garden was bare and brown and smelled of cold earth and wet leaves and the particular November emptiness that felt clean rather than sad if you were in the right state of mind. She walked the perimeter once, which took about 4 minutes, and by the time she completed the loop, the first of her people were arriving through the eastern gate. Claire came first. She always came first to everything. It was a quality of hers that Lyra had relied on for 15 years. The steadiness of someone who understood that showing up early was a form of care. She was 31. 3 years older than Lyra, with the kind of face that didn't perform warmth but simply had it. She came through the gate, looked at Lyra, looked at the garden, looked at Lyra again. "You look sure," she said. "I am sure," Lyra said. "Good." Claire took a position to the left of the gate, and that was that. Rael came next, in his plain clothes, without the formal black. Lyra had told him specifically, no formal clothes, nothing that looks like a ceremony. He had taken the instructions seriously. He stood on the right side of the gate with the ease of a man who attended significant events without needing them to perform their significance. Petra came with him, which Lyra had not expected but found she did not mind. Petra had a quality similar to Rael's, solid, present, not asking for anything. She stood beside him. Lyra's parents arrived together, which meant her father had borrowed a horse from somewhere because they lived 40 minutes from the palace, and she had given less than 24 hours' notice. Her mother's eyes were already bright. Her father, Owen Ashwood, who had carried a political mistake for 6 years with the quiet dignity of a man who would not complain about consequences he understood, looked at his daughter in the bare November garden and made the expression she loved most on his face, the expression of a man who is proud, but knows the pride belongs to someone else, and is simply glad to be allowed to witness it. She had not told them the details. She had said, "Small ceremony, morning, the garden, please come." They had come. Kaylin arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, alone, in dark plain clothes with no silver, no formal coat. He came through the main garden door and walked toward the gate where everyone was gathered and met Lyra's eyes and then stood still and waited, which was what he did when a situation was hers to run. 6 people, 5 witnesses and the 2 of them. This was enough. Lyra took the cord from her jacket pocket. It looked different in the gray morning light than it had in the moonlight on the night of the ceremony. Simpler, less theatrical. The real thing rather than the ceremonial version of the thing. She held it in both hands for a moment. She looked at the people who had come. She had not prepared a speech. She had prepared one sentence, because she found that most of what needed to be said could be said in considerably fewer words than people generally use to say it. "I'm doing this," she said, "because I have decided to." That was the sentence. She looked at Kaylin. He held out his left wrist. She wrapped the cord around it once, the way it had been. Then she held out her right wrist, and he wrapped it around that, and they tied the ends together the way the traditional cord was tied. 3 loops, finishing knot, equal tension on both sides, except that they tied it themselves, together, without the elder's hands in it, without the formal words and the staff and the ceremonial positioning. It took about 30 seconds. When it was done, they both looked down at the thing they had made, and then they looked at each other, and there was nothing dramatic in that look and nothing performed. It was just 2 people who had arrived at a decision from very different directions and met in the same place. Claire, from her position at the left of the gate, made a sound that was not a word. Lyra's mother was crying, which was expected and beloved. Her father was not crying, which was also expected and beloved, but he had the expression she had been carrying in her chest since she was 17, and he had made a mistake and carried it quietly, and the expression was gone, not because of the cord on her wrist, because of the way she was standing. Like someone who had chosen where she was standing. He saw that. She knew he saw it. Rael said, quietly, to Petra, something she could not quite hear. Petra said, equally quietly, something that sounded like, yes. The morning continued to be gray and cold and clean. A bird landed in one of the bare garden trees and made its small sound and left. The clouds moved. At some point, because the garden was November and November does not concern itself with ceremony, it began to rain lightly. Not heavily, just the particular thin November rain that is more suggestion than weather. No one moved. Lyra looked up at the rain for a moment. She had organized the ceremony for morning specifically to avoid the weight of the bonding moon and the theatrical sky, and she had gotten a gray November drizzle instead, which was better in every way that mattered. She looked at Kalen. He was looking at the rain too, and then he looked at her, and something on his face moved in the way it rarely moved in public. Not control, not the contained precision she had learned to read, but something simpler, something closer to the expression a person makes when a calculation they have been running for a long time resolves correctly. She was going to have to learn more about that expression. She had time. The elder is going to be very pleased that this is done, she said. He will be pleased about the completion and displeased about the format, Kalen said, in roughly equal measure. That seems about right. He will write a formal note about the lack of traditional ceremony. I will read it, she said, and then I will put it somewhere. The corner of his mouth moved. She had learned to read that too. Smaller than most people would notice, but present. All right, he said. The rain intensified slightly, and then thought better of it and returned to suggestion. Claire, who had the practical orientation of someone who has attended significant emotional events before and knows what comes after, said, "Is there a plan for breakfast?" There was a plan for breakfast. Lyra had not arranged it, but someone had. Probably Rael, who arranged most things that needed to be arranged without waiting to be asked. The East Wing kitchen had been stocked for 8, which meant that Claire would be comfortable and that Rael had guessed she might attend, which meant Rael had been paying attention to Lyra's people in the same way he paid attention to everything. They went inside in the particular informal order of a group that has just witnessed something and not quite found its equilibrium yet, the way people are at the end of ceremonies when the formal structure releases everyone into just being in the same room. Lyra's mother found the kitchen and immediately understood what needed to happen with the kettle. Her father sat at the table with the expression of a man happy to be given somewhere to sit. Claire surveyed the room and began doing several things at once, which was her nature. Rael and Petra took up positions near the window in the way they had of making themselves useful by being available without being intrusive. Kalen sat at the table across from her father. Her father looked at him. Owen Ashwood, who had spent 6 years being small, being careful, being invisible, carrying his difficulty with dignity and asking nothing of anyone, looked at the king of the Northern Pax sitting across from him at a kitchen table in the east wing of the palace, with the bonding cord on his left wrist and the rain coming down outside the window, and said, "Thank you for going after her." Kalen looked at him. "She did the harder part," he said. Owen Ashwood looked at his daughter. She was at the window with Claire, watching the rain, and her shoulders had the ease of someone who has set down a weight they have been carrying for a long time, and only now is noticing how long their arms had been tired. "She usually does," he said. The rain came down on the garden. The kettle began to whistle. Someone made a sound in another part of the kitchen that was the sound of a person who has found the correct cabinet on the second try. The cord sat on 2 wrists and meant what the 2 people wearing it had decided it meant, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was the whole of it. The kingdom would have thoughts. The kingdom always had thoughts. The elder would write his note. The noble houses would have their conversations. The border lords would write their letters about stability and tradition and the proper ordering of things. There would be formal assessments and diplomatic inquiries and the persistent background noise of a large and opinionated institution adjusting itself to a situation that had not followed the expected shape. All of that was coming. But it was not here yet. Here was a kitchen in November, with rain on the window, and 6 people who had come because they had been asked and wanted to, and a table, and breakfast, and 2 people on opposite sides of a decision they had arrived at from very different directions and now occupied together. Lyra turned from the window. She sat down at the table. She picked up her cup. It had appeared, as things appeared in that kitchen, without her having to ask, and she looked at the cord on her wrist, and at the cord on his wrist, and at the small, deliberate distance that remained between them. The distance of two people who were still in the first stage of something that had many stages. There was time. That was the thing about choosing, rather than having something happen to you. The choosing was not the end. It was the beginning of the part where you found out what you had chosen. She was ready to find out. Outside, the November rain came down on the bare garden and the forest beyond it and the western boundary she had intended to cross and the eastern path that curved around through the dark, and somewhere the Thornvale courtyard stood empty in the gray light, still carrying the memory of a white dress and a turned left and a 4-second silence. She was not that woman anymore. She was not the woman with the bag of 43 coins and the escape route memorized and the quiet, exhausted practice of gratitude for things she had not chosen. She was someone who had chosen. She drank her tea. She listened to her mother tell Claire something about the drive from the eastern property. She watched her father and the king sit at the same table and find, in the careful early-stage way of two people with no reason yet to trust each other, and every reason to try, the first cautious shape of a conversation. She let the morning be what it was. Gray and cold and clean and hers. The noble houses gave her 3 weeks of privacy before they found their approach. It was not hostility exactly. Lyra had been expecting hostility and had prepared for it in the way she prepared for most things, by reading everything relevant, identifying the likely vectors, and making sure she understood the rules of the engagement before the engagement began. What she had not fully prepared for was the specific texture of what the noble houses offered instead, a kind of careful, formal, watchful courtesy that contained questions inside it, the way a glove contains a hand. The first to come was Lady Marin Holt, who represented the oldest house in the Western Territory and had the particular manner of someone who had been attending pack functions for 40 years and had made an art of saying difficult things in beautiful language. She arrived at the palace on a Tuesday, officially to discuss a minor boundary adjustment that had been pending for 2 seasons, and stayed for a meeting that lasted 90 minutes. Lyra was not in that meeting. She was not in it because it was a formal territorial discussion in the king's receiving room, and she did not have a formal role in the palace's diplomatic function. She was in the library, where she had been every morning that week, working through the reclassification project with the archivist staff. She knew about the meeting because Rael told her afterward, in the corridor, in his precise way. Lady Holt asked 3 questions, he said. The first was about the boundary adjustment, which was the stated purpose and was addressed. The second was about the bonding ceremony format, which the king addressed in 2 sentences that did not invite further discussion. The third was about your role. What did she ask, specifically? She asked whether your presence at the morning briefings was an official appointment or a personal arrangement. Lyra was quiet for a moment. What did he say? He said it was neither, and that the distinction she was drawing was less useful than she might expect. Rael paused. He then redirected the conversation to the boundary adjustment. She thought about this. She'll be back. They will all be back, Rael said. The question you've raised is a real one. The pact does not have a category for you. You are not the queen. There has been no formal title or appointment. You are not a visitor or a guest, because guests do not have archive instruction authority. You are not a member of the court in any formal sense. I know, she said. The noble houses are going to need something to call you, he said, not out of hostility, out of institutional necessity. The pack runs on categories, and you are currently outside all of them. She looked at the stack of reclassification documents in her arms. She had been thinking about this, in the mornings on the windowsill, in the quiet between the briefings and the library and the working dinners that had begun in the past week, evenings where she and Kaelin sat in the working office after the day's formal business and went through correspondence together, dividing the work by instinct rather than assignment. She had been thinking about the category problem not as a threat but as a genuine question. What category does the pack actually need, she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. One that matches what you're doing, Rael said, which is, functionally, the work of an advisor with decision-making authority in specific domains. She nodded slowly. The pack has a word for that. It does, he said. The King's Council, she said. It's a historical appointment. There's no formal structure for it anymore because the last 3 kings handled their council function through the commander structure, but the title exists. Rael looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of being impressed, which was subtle enough that some people probably missed it. Yes, he said. It's not a royal title, she said. It doesn't carry the formal weight of the queen designation, which I haven't asked for, and am not ready to ask for. It's an advisory appointment. The authority would be tied to specific domains rather than general court function. The elder would prefer the queen designation, Rael said, because it fits the established pattern. The elder can prefer whatever he likes, Lyra said. I'm interested in what's accurate. She shifted the documents to her other arm. Draft the appointment structure for the King's Council designation. Historical precedent for the language. What domains would fall under it given what I'm actually doing? Whether there's a formal acceptance process. Rael was quiet for a moment. That is considerable work, he said. It's 3 days of work, she said. Maybe 4. I'll do the historical research. You do the current legal framework. We bring it to the briefing when it's ready. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile. All right, he said. She went back to the library. She told Kaelin that evening, not framing it as a request but as a plan she had developed and was informing him of because he should know. She watched his face while she talked, which had become a habit, not because she did not trust what he said, but because the face was more immediate than the words, and she was building a practice of reading both. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, the working quiet, the one that meant he was thinking through something rather than reacting to it. The council designation, he said. It fits what I'm already doing, she said. It gives the noble houses a category. It's not the elder's preferred option, which is a consideration, but it's accurate, he said. Which is more important than the elder's preference? Yes, she said. He looked at the fire. The last person who held that designation was my grandfather's third council, he said. Her name was Elspeth Ward. She served for 22 years. She negotiated the River Treaty with the Eastern Territories that is still in effect. Lyra filed this. What happened to the position after her? My father didn't appoint anyone. He thought the commander structure was sufficient. A pause. It wasn't. Always. No, she said. I've seen some of the gaps in the Eastern Territory files. He looked at her. You've been working through those. The misfiling project naturally extends into them, she said. 60 years of incorrectly cross-referenced material means 60 years of cases where someone working from the correctly filed records couldn't see the full picture. He nodded slowly. She had the impression he was making a connection she had not made explicit, and making it accurately. Bring the full document to the briefing when it's ready, he said. We'll go through it together. She went back to the East Wing that evening and wrote 4 pages of notes about Elspeth Ward from memory, which was everything she had managed to find in the historical records about the previous council. Not much, because the records from that era were thin, but enough to understand the shape of the role and the particular way it had functioned. Ward had not been in the formal court. She had not attended ceremonial functions or represented the crown at territorial negotiations. She had advised. She had identified the gaps, exactly as Lyra had been doing with the misfiled archives, and filled them, quietly and without fanfare, in a way that made the formal structure work better. This was the shape of the thing Lyra was good at. Not the formal, not the ceremonial, not the public function of power, the operational, the practical, the identification of the thing that was not working, and the calm, patient, specific work of correcting it. She could do this here. She was already doing it. Rael's draft arrived 3 days later, as promised. It was precise, well-sourced, and contained a framework for the appointment that was legally sound and practically manageable. She read it twice, made 12 annotations, and sent it back. He made adjustments. She read the adjusted version and made 4 more notes. He sent it back again. The process took 5 days in total, which she thought was appropriate for something that was going to be in use for potentially a very long time. They brought it to the briefing on a Friday, which was a day when the briefing ran shorter than usual because the weekly border reports had come in clean. Lyra presented it, not as something she was asking for, but as something she was proposing on behalf of the functional efficiency of the palace's advisory structure. She walked through the historical precedent, the current legal framework, the specific domains the appointment would cover, and the oversight structure that would make the authority clear without making it vague. The table was quiet when she finished. Aldrich said, "That's sensible." He said it with the directness he had had since the Column 4 correction, which was the directness of a person who had decided that underestimating her once was enough. Wynne said, "The noble houses will be satisfied with it." Petra said nothing, which was Petra's version of agreement. Rael said, "The elder won't be." "No," Lyra said, "but his preference is for a royal designation that I'm not prepared to accept, and this is the appropriate alternative. He knows the historical precedent. He can't argue the legal framework." Kaelin had been listening without speaking, as he sometimes did when the discussion was going correctly and his participation would add less than the space it might close. He looked at her. "Do you want to go forward with it?" "Yes," she said. "Then we will." The formal appointment documentation was prepared over the following week. It was a slim document, 3 pages, not 30, and it said what it said clearly, and did not attempt to make itself more important than it was by using more words than necessary. The council designation, the specific domains, the decision-making authority within those domains, the structure for oversight and accountability. The elder received a copy, as was appropriate. He did not respond immediately. He responded after 4 days, in a letter that was 7 pages long and technically impeccable, and ultimately acknowledged that the appointment was legally sound. He included 2 paragraphs about the importance of completing the formal royal designation process at the earliest opportunity, which Lyra read and set aside and did not respond to because the letter did not require a response. Lady Holt received a formal notification, as did the other major noble house representatives. Lyra watched the responses come in over the following week with the interest of someone studying a system they are trying to understand. Most of the responses were civil, cool in some cases, warmer in others, but civil. 3 of the responses were, in diplomatic language, expressions of approval. One response, from the house whose representative had been most vocally concerned about the ceremony format, said nothing at all, which was itself a kind of answer. The border lords took another week to respond, and their responses were different in character. Less concerned with the formal designation and more concerned with the practical question of what it meant for the supply and communication systems they depended on. 2 of them asked, very specifically, whether the council appointment extended to border agreements. The answer was yes, under the appropriate domain structure. Both responses after that were positive. Harwick sent a personal note that was not in the formal diplomatic language, which was a signal she had learned to read as a form of respect. He said that the patent on the appointment looked sensible, and that the patrol agreement renewal was going smoothly, and that he hoped to visit the palace in the spring to discuss the Western Passage Treaty update. She wrote back herself, not in the formal correspondence language, in her own voice, which was the voice she was learning to use in these contexts. Direct without being cold, warm without being informal, the voice of someone who meant what she said and said what she meant. She told him the spring visit would be welcome and that she had been reviewing the Western Passage Treaty history and had some thoughts about the update that she would like to discuss in person. He replied in 2 days. His reply said, "Good." The work that followed was not dramatic. This was something she had understood from the beginning, something she had learned from watching her father work. The real work, the work that made things function, was rarely dramatic. It was consistent. It was patient. It was the kind of work that produced results not in the form of sudden breakthroughs but in the form of systems that ran better, gaps that closed, problems that stopped reappearing because the conditions that created them had been addressed. She addressed conditions. She did it at the briefing table and in the library and in the working office in the evenings, and she did it in the annotated margins of documents that moved between her desk and various other desks in the palace, and she did it in the letters she wrote to border lords and village elders and territorial representatives who were surprised, the first time, to receive a communication from the King's Council, and who, the second time, were not surprised at all. The mornings on the windowsill became mornings at the East Wing kitchen table with coffee and the first documents of the day. The separate entrance from the garden remained, because she had not asked to change it and Kaelin had not suggested changing it, and the particular shape of what they were to each other was still something they were building rather than something they had named. That was fine. She had time. The cord on her wrist was the color of dark rope, and it sat there every day and said the thing she had decided it said, and that was enough for now, and more than enough for now. And the rest was the slow, careful daily work of people who have chosen each other and are beginning to find out what that means. The crisis came in February, the way crises often do, without warning and in the middle of something else. She was in the working office reviewing the Western Passage Treaty draft with Kaelin when the runner arrived, 17 years old, travel-stained, pale with the particular pallor of someone who has been riding through cold for many hours without stopping. He delivered the message directly to the king, which was appropriate because the message was addressed to the king, and the message said that the garrison at the northern border post had been abandoned. Not attacked, not overrun, abandoned. All 212 soldiers, in the night, without notice, without formal leave or order, without any communication that anyone at the palace had received. The garrison at Post 7, which guarded the northern mountain approach that was the only reliable winter passage into the Dravith territory from the north, was empty. Kaelin read the message once. He looked up. "Get rail," he said to the runner. The runner left. Lyra looked at the message in Kaelin's hand, then at the Western Passage Treaty draft on the table between them, suddenly very much less urgent. "Post 7 is Garrison Commander Fenwick's post," she said. "Yes." Fenwick has been requesting additional supply allocation for 3 consecutive quarters. Kaylin looked at her. His allocation requests have been coming through the border command, she said. But the supply calculations I found in the column 4 correction, the systematic underfunding in the western stations, the model was applied to the northern posts as well. I included that in the corrected analysis, but the northern post adjustments haven't been processed yet. She was moving while she talked, going to the document shelf, pulling the supply allocation file she needed. They were next in the queue, after the western stations. They were supposed to be addressed this month. She found the file. She opened it. Fenwick's requests were there. 3 of them, each one more formally worded than the last. Each one bearing the quiet precision of a commander who had been very careful to remain within proper channels, while his post ran short of food and equipment, through a winter that had been, by all the weather reports she had been reading, severe. Rail came in. Kaylin handed him the abandonment message. Rail read it with the expression he used for situations that required his full attention, rather than his efficient processing. He didn't notify, Rail said. He notified 3 times, Lyra said. She set Fenwick's supply requests on the table. He notified the border command. The notifications were processed correctly. The allocation adjustment was correctly calculated. The implementation was delayed because of the queue from the western station corrections. The room was very quiet. How delayed? Kaylin said. She looked at the file. The western stations took 11 weeks from identification to implementation. The northern posts were entered into the queue 6 weeks ago. She looked up. He has been underfunded for at least 9 months. He has been correctly requesting adjustments for 3 quarters. He has received no response to his most recent request, which was sent 2 months ago, because it is in a queue that will not reach it for another 5 weeks. Aldrich, who had followed Rail in, said, he walked 212 soldiers out of a winter post in February. Without notice to the palace, Rail said. He was looking at Fenwick's requests. 3 correct formal requests. No response for 2 months. He set the papers down. His soldiers were hungry. The word sat in the room. Yes, Lyra said. Kaylin looked at the abandonment message, at Fenwick's requests, at the supply allocation file. His face had the quality of a man doing several things at once, processing, deciding, assigning responsibility, preparing for what came next, and the quality was not anger exactly, though there was anger in it, but something closer to the concentrated focus of someone who is looking at a failure in a system they are responsible for, and intends to fix it. Find Fenwick, he said to Rail. Not to bring him back under guard. Find him. Tell him I want to speak to him. Tell him. He stopped, looked at Lyra. Tell him the supply adjustment is being processed today, she said. Tell him his requests were correctly filed and correctly calculated, and the implementation failure was a systemic issue that has been identified and is being corrected. She looked at the file. Tell him his soldiers will eat. Rail looked at her, then at Kaylin, who nodded once. I'll go myself, Rail said. Take whatever you need for the supply delivery, Kaylin said. Full allocation, not the adjusted queue amount. Whatever Post 7 requires for the remainder of winter, today. Rail left. They heard him in the corridor issuing rapid, precise instructions to 2 junior staff members, the sound of competence in motion. Aldrich remained in the room, looking at the documents on the table. He was 26 and sometimes still showed things on his face that the older commanders did not show. Right now he showed the particular expression of a person understanding that a systemic failure they were part of had caused a real consequence to real people. The Northern Post queue, he said. Goes through today, Lyra said. All of them. I'll work through the rest of the allocation corrections with you this afternoon. The Western corrections took 11 weeks to implement, he said. The Western corrections went through the standard approval chain, she said. We are adjusting that chain. What we find in the Northern Review goes directly to Supply Command, without the intermediate queue step. She looked at Kaylin. That's a process change. I need your agreement. You have it, he said. She looked at Aldrich. This afternoon. He nodded. Kaylin was at the window when Aldrich left. He had his hands behind his back, which was how he stood when he was working through something that did not have a clean resolution. She gave him the space of the moment. She had learned when to move in and when to be still, and this was a still moment. The soldiers were hungry, he said after a while. Yes, she said. Because a correct request went into a queue. Because a correct request went into a queue that was correct for the initial correction process, but is not the right process for ongoing supply operations, she said. She was careful to be accurate rather than reassuring. The Western correction identified a systematic problem. The process I built to address the Western stations was adequate for that corrective action. It was not adequate as an ongoing supply management system. That is a design failure I should have caught. He turned from the window. You've been here less than 4 months. That's not relevant, she said. The failure is the failure. What matters now is that we build the right process so it doesn't happen again. He looked at her for a moment. The expression on his face was something she was still in the process of learning to read. Something that happened on the territory between what he thought and what he let be visible, and which appeared more often now than it had in the first weeks. There are people in this pack, he said quietly, who have been doing this work for years and have not identified what you found in 3 months. 60 years of misfiled history helped, she said. Lyra. She looked at him. He crossed the room. He took the supply allocation file from her hands, gently, not removing it but giving her hands something to do instead, which was, he held them for a moment, briefly, the cord on his wrist touching the cord on hers, and then let go. It was a small gesture. It said, I see what you're doing and I see why, and I also see what you actually did, and it was significant, and both of those things can be true at once. She understood it. She was getting better at understanding his gestures. Afternoon, she said. Afternoon, he agreed. She went to find Aldrich. The supply corrections for the northern posts took the remainder of the day and part of the evening. Aldrich was good at this kind of work when the pressure was real. He had a quality she had noticed before, a capacity to focus when the stakes were visible. That was different from his performance in routine briefings. By 7 o'clock they had processed the full corrected allocation for all 11 northern posts and sent it to Supply Command with the new approval routing that bypassed the intermediate queue. By 7:30, Rail had sent a message from the road. Fenwick was found. His soldiers were camped 2 hours south of the post. They were cold and tired, and had a disciplined, stubborn quality that Rail noted spoke well of their commander. They were returning. By 10 o'clock, the first supply delivery confirmation was back from the western stations, showing the new routing was operational. Lyra sat in the briefing room with the confirmation documents and a cup of cold tea, and the particular exhaustion of a day that had been very full, and she thought about 212 soldiers walking out of a winter post into the cold because their requests had gone into a queue. She wrote the process redesign document that night, not all of it. The full structure would take several days to get right, but the framework, the core principle that separated the corrective process from the operational process, the routing that removed the bottleneck, the escalation trigger that would flag any supply request that had received no response within 30 days, regardless of queue position. She left it on the briefing room table. In the morning it had notes in Rail's handwriting in the margins. She incorporated the notes. She left the revised version. By the third day it had notes from all 4 commanders, and the version that went to Supply Command for implementation was built from 5 sets of eyes, and was better for every pair of them. This was the other thing she was learning. Not just the work itself, but the way the work could be done, the way a document moved around a table and came back improved, the way 4 people who were each good at different things could look at the same problem and see different elements of it, and the way the thing that emerged from that process was not any one person's vision but something more useful and more durable. She had been a solitary worker for most of her life, a person who went away and thought about things and came back with analysis. She was learning to be something different, not solitary, not the single voice with the correct answer, but a person who knew how to build the right room for a problem, and then work the problem in that room with the right people. This was harder than the solitary version. It required trusting that other people's eyes were as useful as hers. She was working on that. Fenwick arrived at the palace on the 4th day after the abandonment, which was fast enough that he had clearly pushed himself and his horse hard. He was 53 years old and had the look of a career soldier who had spent most of that career in cold places and had stopped being surprised by hardship while retaining a clear and unforgiving sense of when hardship was unnecessary. He went to the king's receiving room. Lyra was not in the meeting. She had not asked to be, because this was a moment between a king and a commander, and her presence would change the quality of it in ways that would not serve either of them. She was in the corridor outside the briefing room with the new supply design document when Fenwick came back through after an hour, and he stopped when he saw her and looked at her for a moment. She was the king's counsel, which meant by now he knew who she was. The northern post allocation, he said. Corrected and routed, she said. The new escalation trigger means any request without a 30-day response gets an automatic flag to Supply Command and to the council office. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document in her hands. Who built the 30-day flag? I did, she said, with 4 people's notes in the margins. Something moved on his face, not warmth exactly, but the recognition a practical person gives to something practical. Good, he said. He went on. She went back to the briefing room. That evening, Kaelin found her there. She was still working. The process document was in its fourth revision, and she was not satisfied with the escalation chain in Section 3. He put a plate down beside her documents. She looked at the plate, then at him. "You haven't eaten since this morning," he said. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been in the working office since noon, and the East Wing kitchen tray came back untouched." She looked at the plate. It was a reasonable meal. She picked up the fork. "Section 3 of the escalation structure is wrong," she said. He sat down and read Section 3. "The 30-day flag triggers to both Supply Command and the Council Office," he said. "Yes, but the Council Office trigger requires a response, which means it becomes a decision point instead of an information point, which creates a bottleneck in a different place." She turned the document. "It should flag to both as information. The escalation action should be automatic. If 30 days passes with no resolution, the request auto-approves at the last submitted allocation level." He was quiet for a moment, reading. "That gives supply commanders the ability to effectively auto-approve their own requests." "Yes," she said. "Which is the appropriate authority for operational supply. If there's a problem with the auto-approval level, the review process catches it in the quarterly audit. The point is to make the default response to silence be supply, not more waiting." He looked at the document. Then he looked at her. "Write it." She ate her dinner and revised Section 3, and the document that went out the following morning was cleaner and more functional, and the kingdom's 200 soldiers in the northern posts ate their dinner that night without having to wonder when someone was going to notice they were running short. This was the work. She was doing it. Spring arrived slowly in the Northern Territory, the way it always did. Not in a moment, but in the accumulation of small signs. The garden outside the East Wing window began to show the first green beneath the brown. The light changed before the warmth did. The mud season came and went. By April there was actual color in the palace grounds, and the mornings at the kitchen table had graduated from the closed-window cold air kind to the open-window kind, with the garden sounds coming in and the pale early light making everything look like the beginning of something. Lyra was reading the River Treaty when the door to the East Wing kitchen opened and her mother walked in. This was not surprising in itself. Her parents had been to the palace 3 times since February, a frequency that reflected Owen Ashwood's gradual, tentative return to something like confidence in the world. The difficulty, as he still called it, had cost him 6 years of influence and connection, and the recovery of those things was not happening quickly, but it was happening. He had been asked twice to sit on the Eastern Territory arbitration panel, which was not a major appointment, but was visible in the right circles. He had accepted both times with the quiet dignity that was his characteristic mode. What was surprising was that her mother was carrying a box. Not a small box, a substantial box. The kind that required both arms, the kind that had clearly come a distance and been carefully packed for that distance. Her mother set it on the kitchen table beside Lyra's River Treaty document, and stood back with the expression of a woman who has been waiting to do something for a long time, and is very pleased to finally be doing it. "What is this?" Lyra said. "Your grandmother's house things," her mother said. "The ones that were packed when your grandmother moved in with us. The fabric for the window covers, the copper set, the 2 lamps that she always said were going to the eldest child." She opened the box. There was, indeed, a substantial amount of fabric and the glint of copper, and 2 lamps of a style that were perhaps 50 years old, and had the look of things made by someone who intended them to last. "I've been holding them since last autumn," her mother said. "I didn't want to bring them too early. But this is your home now." Lyra looked at the box. She had not thought of it in those words. She had thought, the East Wing, the palace, the place where she lived and worked and sat on the windowsill and ate breakfast under notes and walked through open doors. She had not thought home. She looked at the fabric. It was a deep green, dark and particular, the kind of green that came from a specific plant in a specific region, the kind you could not easily replicate with a different source. She had seen this fabric at her grandmother's house when she was a child. She had sat in the rooms where it covered the windows, in the particular quality of light that came through it, and she had not thought about it in years. "Mum," she said. "You don't have to put it up immediately," her mother said, in the tone of a woman who absolutely thinks you should put it up immediately. "I just thought—" Lyra got up and hugged her mother. Her mother, who was not small and had the physical quality of a woman who had worked hard for most of her life, held on. For a moment they were just that. A mother and a daughter who had been navigating something complicated together for the past 6 months, and had not always found the space to say the simple things. "Thank you," Lyra said. "Your grandmother would have liked him," her mother said. She set it into Lyra's shoulder, which meant she could not be seen saying it, which meant she had decided it was something that needed to be said, but was easier to say without making eye contact. She would have liked that he listened. Lyra stood back. Her mother had the bright eyes she always got when she was close to something that mattered to her. "He does," Lyra said. "I know," her mother said. "I watched. At the breakfast, after the ceremony. He talked to your father for 40 minutes and did not once say anything your father had to pretend to agree with." This was, Lyra reflected, the most specific expression of approval her mother had available for a person. The observation that he had not required her husband to perform his own smallness. It was, in the context of the past 6 years, significant. "I'll put the fabric up," Lyra said. "I brought the measuring cord," her mother said, and produced it from her pocket. They spent the better part of the morning in the East Wing doing the kind of domestic work that has nothing to do with supply chains or diplomatic correspondence or 60 years of misfiled archives. Measuring windows, discussing placement, making decisions about where the copper set should go and whether the lamp in the east-facing alcove would give enough light for reading, or whether it wanted to be moved slightly south. It was profoundly ordinary, and Lyra found it, in some way she had not anticipated, necessary. She had been doing large things for months, important things, useful things, things that had consequences beyond her own daily experience. This was small. This was her grandmother's fabric on her windows, because this was her home. Because her mother had waited until it felt right to say that, and had decided in April that it was right to say it. Harwick arrived on a Thursday in late April for the spring visit he had mentioned in his letter. He was a big man, physically, the kind of build that came from generations of people who lived in cold places and did physical work, with a direct manner that Lyra had been building a picture of from his correspondence and found matched the picture closely. He came to the palace for the formal visit, attended 2 days of territorial discussions with Kaelin and the border command staff, and on the third day asked to speak with the King's Council. This was the first time anyone had requested a meeting with her formally, in her capacity as counsel, rather than reaching her through the daily briefing or through the routing of documents. She received the request, confirmed a time, and met Harwick in the small meeting room off the main corridor rather than the briefing room, because the briefing room was the King's room, and this meeting was in her domain. Harwick came in, looked at the room, looked at her, and sat down across from her without preamble. "The Western Passage Treaty," he said. 11 years since the last review. I've read your notes on the historical file." She had sent him the analysis 3 weeks earlier, not as an official communication but as a working document, the kind of thing she might circulate internally, but which she had sent to him on the basis that he was the person most directly affected and had a right to see the analysis before the formal negotiation began. She said, "The second clause is the problem," he said. "Has been for 8 years. The patrol rotation language is ambiguous, and the Southwest Garrison has been covering for that ambiguity out of its own budget, because no one wanted to raise it formally." She had thought the second clause was the problem. What does covering for the ambiguity cost the Southwest Garrison annually? He named a figure. It was not enormous, but it was not small, and across 8 years it had accumulated into something that had, she suspected, been quietly shaping the garrison's capacity, in ways that the official records did not show. "Who knows about this?" she said. "Me. My garrison commander, the previous garrison commander, who retired." A pause. "I am telling you because the treaty review is coming, and because you sent me the analysis, as though I were someone you were working with, rather than someone you were managing." She looked at him. He was a border lord, someone the palace's relationship with had historically been transactional, managed through the formal channels of territorial obligation and periodic treaty review. He was telling her something real, because she had, apparently, communicated something to him that made that feel worthwhile. "The second clause needs to be rewritten from the base," she said, "not amended. The ambiguity is structural. Patching it creates new ambiguities. We need to start from what the patrol rotation is actually supposed to accomplish, and write language that describes that clearly." Harwick nodded. "I'll send you my garrison commander's notes on what the practical rotation looks like currently. That would be useful," she said. They talked for 2 hours. By the end of it she had the clearest picture yet of the Western Passage's actual operational requirements, which were significantly different from the picture the existing treaty presented, and Harwick had the beginning of a working relationship with the King's Council that was based on something other than formal obligation. When he left, she sat in the small meeting room for a while with her notes. She was building something. She had been building it for months without quite naming what it was. The briefing table and the library floor, and the supply chain corrections and the process redesigns and the annotated documents and the open doors and the separate entrance that she still used, not because she needed it, but because she had chosen it, and choices that you have made are worth honoring. She was building a way of being in this place that was hers, Not the place the ceremony had intended for her, not the formal royal designation the elder kept mentioning, not the category the noble houses had needed to construct. The way she had built it herself, from the things she was actually good at, from the work she actually did. In the late afternoon she went to the working office to tell Kalen about the second clause. She knocked. "Come in," he said. She came in. She sat in the plain chair. She told him about the Southwest Garrison's 8 years of absorbing the ambiguity in the second clause, and about the figure Harwick had named, and about the plan to rewrite the clause from the base rather than patch it. She said it all without decoration because he read documents the way she did, looking for the specific useful content rather than the frame around it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Harwick told you this," he said. "Yes." "He hasn't raised it through formal channels in 8 years. "No. But he told you." She thought about what Harwick had said. "You sent me the analysis as though I were someone you were working with rather than someone you were managing. I think there are a number of people in this territory who have accurate information about how things are actually working," she said carefully, "and who have not shared that information through the formal channels because the formal channels have not, in their experience, been responsive." She looked at the document in her hands. Fenwick's supply requests, Harwick's second clause, the Eastern Village's water situation, the misfiled archives. She looked up. These are not unrelated. He was looking at her with the expression she had been learning for months. It was a particular kind of attention, full, direct, the kind that made what you were saying feel exactly as important as it was. "Tell me what you mean," he said. She laid it out, carefully, because she was working through it as she spoke, which was a different mode from the mode of presenting analysis she had already finished. She talked about the gap between the formal structure of the pack and the operational reality of it, the way the two had diverged over years without the divergence being noticed, because the people who could see the divergence were the ones interacting with the operational reality, and the formal channels had not been structured to receive what they knew. "Fenwick requested through the proper channels," she said. "It went into the correct queue. The queue was designed for a different kind of volume and a different kind of priority than it was actually being asked to handle. The result was that a correct request from a functional commander went unaddressed for 9 months, and 200 soldiers ate less than they should have eaten, and then walked away from a winter post." She paused. "The formal channel worked. The formal channel produced a failure. Those are not contradictions." He was very still. "The treaty review process is formal," she said. "It happens on a schedule. It goes through the appropriate channels. Harwick has been waiting for 8 years for the treaty review process to generate a conversation in which he could raise the second clause issue. In the meantime, his garrison absorbs the cost." She looked at him. "Who else has been absorbing costs we don't know about because the formal channels haven't generated the conversation?" The working office was quiet. The spring evening was coming through the window, warmer than the months before, the first real warmth of the year, carrying the smell of the garden and the earth coming back to itself. "That is a very large question," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He stood up. He went to the window and stood there for a moment, and then he turned. "I want you to design a review," he said. "Comprehensive. Every territory, every formal channel. What is it receiving, and what is it not receiving, and what is the gap between the two? I want to know what's in the formal record and what isn't, and I want to know why." She looked at him. This was large, significantly larger than anything she had been doing. "That is months of work," she said. "Done properly, it's a year." "Yes," he said. "You're asking me to audit the entire territorial communication structure." "I'm asking you to design the audit," he said. "You will need people. You will need to identify who they should be and what their authority looks like. You will need a process that earns the trust of the people who are currently not using the formal channels." She thought about the scope of this. She thought about Rail and Aldrich and the archivist's staff, and Harwick and his garrison commander, and Fenwick, and the Eastern Village elders, and the supply commanders in 11 northern posts. She thought about the shape of a thing that was trying to close the gap between what was formally known and what was actually true. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She left with the document and the framework already beginning to form, because her mind worked this way, in frameworks, in structures, in the shape of the solution before the specific content of it. She went back to the east wing and sat at the kitchen table and began writing. The window above the table had the dark green fabric on it now, her grandmother's fabric, and the evening light coming through it had a particular quality, warm and specific and already familiar. She wrote until late. She wrote the beginning of the structure that would take a year to build and would change, she suspected, a great deal of what the palace knew about its own territory, and what the territory knew about the palace. This was the work. She was ready for it. The audit took 14 months. Lyra had told him it would take a year, and it took 14 months, which was close enough given the scope of what it had become by the time they were finished. What began as a review of the territorial communication structure expanded in ways she had not fully anticipated, not because the work grew beyond its initial intent, but because the initial intent kept revealing deeper layers of the same problem, the way an honest excavation sometimes does. She hired 6 people, not from the palace staff, from the territories themselves, from the operational level where the formal channels met the actual working reality. She looked for the qualities she had been learning to recognize, people who saw the gap between what the record said and what was actually happening, and who were capable of describing that gap accurately, without the distortion of either performance or resentment. They were not easy people to find, because most people who had been doing good work in an invisible way had also developed, over time, a reasonable skepticism about whether the visible level cared to know. The first 3 she found through the supply correction work. They were garrison supply officers who had been flagging accurate issues through correct channels and had received either no response or the wrong response for years. They came to the audit work with a precise understanding of what the formal system did and did not register. The next 2 she found through the water rights dispute resolution. The joint council that had come out of the Eastern Village disagreement had produced, as a byproduct, 2 people who understood how to sit in a room with people who did not trust formal structures and have a conversation that was worth having. The 6th she found by accident, in the misfiled archives. His name was Garrett, he was 38, and he had been a territorial records clerk in the Northeast for 11 years. He had noticed the misfiling 5 years before Lyra arrived at the palace, had tried to raise it twice through the archivist's formal report structure, had received no response, and had eventually spent his own time creating a manual cross-reference index on paper, because the official system couldn't be trusted to connect the records correctly. The manual index was sitting in his office when the audit team reached the Northeast. She hired him on the spot. He relocated to the palace, took the Northeast section of the audit, and became the person she trusted most with the question of what was missing from the formal record, because he had been asking that question for 5 years before anyone else thought to ask it. The audit process produced findings in waves. The first wave was the supply and allocation issues, which they had partly surfaced already, the systematic underfunding, the queue problems, the misfiled requests. But the audit revealed that these were not isolated instances, they were characteristic. The formal process had been designed for a territory that was smaller and slower than the territory it was currently managing, and the gap between the design and the reality had been filled, for decades, by operational-level staff, who absorbed the costs and filled the gaps, and did not formally report what they were doing, because the formal system did not have a category for it. The second wave was the communication gap. Territories that had things to say to the palace and had stopped trying to say them because nothing had come back. Village elders who had submitted formal requests 3 years ago and had never received a confirmation that the request was received, let alone a substantive response. Garrison commanders who had begun making independent operational decisions they should not have had to make because waiting for the formal channel had become, functionally, the same thing as doing nothing. The third wave was the most important and took the longest to surface, because it required trust rather than just access. It was the things that had never entered the formal system at all, not because people had tried and been ignored, but because the experience of watching others try and be ignored had produced, over time, the rational conclusion that there was no point in trying. Lyra spent 2 months in the Eastern and Northern Territories herself, which was something Rael did not think was the right use of the King's Council's time, and said so clearly, and which she did anyway, because she had come to understand that the quality of information she received depended significantly on whether she was the person receiving it, or whether it was coming through an intermediary. The audit team was good, but the specific quality of a conversation with someone who had given up on the formal system and was being asked why, by the person who might actually do something about the answer, was different from the same conversation conducted by a staff member. She was in a village in the Northwest in October, a farming settlement that had been managing a water access problem for 7 years, through a combination of informal arrangements among the 5 involved households and periodic negotiations that produced agreements lasting about 3 seasons before they unraveled, when the person she was talking to said something she wrote down immediately and carried back to the palace. The person was a woman in her 60s named Ruth Caldwell, who ran the largest of the 5 farms, and who had been the informal anchor of the water arrangements for most of those 7 years. She had tried the formal arbitration process once, 7 years ago. It had produced a written agreement that did not reflect the actual seasonal variation in water availability, and which had collapsed within 2 growing seasons because it was technically correct and practically wrong. She had not tried again. Lyra asked her to describe what a useful formal process would have looked like. Ruth Caldwell was quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of someone who has thought about a thing for a long time and is now being asked to articulate it to someone who might actually listen. It would have asked us first, she said, not what the rules are, what the water does. The rules don't know what the water does. We know what the water does. Lyra wrote it down. She brought it back to the palace and added it to the audit document, and it became the principle that organized the entire third section of the final report. The information necessary to govern a territory well is held primarily by the people living in the territory, and the formal system's primary failure has been its orientation. It has been structured to deliver information down rather than to receive it up, and the consequence is that the decisions made at the formal level are regularly made without the information necessary to make them correctly. The audit report was 300 pages. Kaylin read all 300 pages. She knew because he returned it with notes in the margins. Not corrections, not challenges, but the particular kind of questions that a person asks when they are reading something carefully and want to understand every element of it. The notes in the margins of the third section were the most numerous. She answered the questions in a separate document. He read that document. He asked more questions. They went back and forth across the document for 2 weeks, which was a kind of conversation she had become very accustomed to having with him. Detailed, specific, operating at the level of particular things rather than general principles, with both of them bringing their different kinds of knowledge to the same questions. At the end of the 2 weeks, he said, "What does fixing this look like?" She had a document for that too. It was not a simple document. The repair of a territorial communication structure that had been diverging from its operational reality for decades was not a simple project, and she was not going to pretend it was. She had organized it into phases, some of which could begin immediately, some of which required groundwork that would take years, some of which required things the pack had never tried and which might not work and would need to be tested carefully and adjusted based on what was learned. The principle at the center of it was Ruth Caldwell's principle, restated in the language of governance. Decisions made at the formal level should be built on information received from the operational level, and the system should be designed to make that flow reliable, rather than dependent on individual persistence. "This is a significant restructure," Kaylin said. They were in the working office, late, the spring evening coming through the window, the second spring since the ceremony, the green returning to the garden for the second time since she had sat on the windowsill watching it come. "It will require resources, it will require time, some of it will fail." "Yes," she said. "And you believe it is worth doing?" "I believe the cost of not doing it is higher than the cost of doing it," she said. The audit made that clear. The underfunding, the garrison abandonment, the water disputes, the 7 years of informal workarounds in the Northwest, those are costs. They are ongoing. The restructure is also a cost, but it is a cost that reduces the other costs over time. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document. "Where do we start?" he said. "The escalation process," she said. "It's already working. We expand it." She moved to the first page of the implementation plan. "The flagging structure we built after Fenwick. We build the same structure across every formal channel. Every request, every report, every communication from the operational level. If it receives no response within 30 days, it flags automatically and escalates. The formal system cannot lose things. That is manageable," he said. "It is the easy part," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me the hard part." "The hard part is changing what the formal channels ask for. Not just whether they receive what is sent, but whether they ask for the right things. The formal system has been asking for compliance information, whether rules are being followed, whether allocations are within budget, whether reports are submitted on time. It has not been asking for operational reality, what is actually happening, what is working, what is not, what do people in the territory actually know that we don't." She set down the implementation plan. She looked at the window, the garden, the familiar shape of the evening. "Ruth Caldwell asked us first, not what the rules are, what the water does." She looked at him. "We need to build a system that asks what the water does." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Will you build it?" She looked at him. 2 years ago she had run from a ceremony in a white dress. She had sat on a root in the moonlight and told a stranger about 11 months of quiet, exhausted preparation for escape. She had come back to a palace not because she was brought back but because she had chosen to, and she had built a way of being in that palace that was hers, and she had found in the building of it that what she was building was larger than she had initially understood. She had found that she was good at this, not the formal kind of good, not the kind that was recognized by title and ceremony and the elders' 7 legal citations, the practical kind, The kind that mattered to the 200 soldiers in the northern posts, and to Ruth Caldwell and her 7-year water arrangement, and to Garrett with his manual cross-reference index, and to Harwick's southwest garrison, and to the eastern village elders who had finally had a conversation worth having. She looked at the cord on her wrist. She looked at the cord on his wrist. The same cord, 2 wrists, chosen by both of them on a gray November morning in the Bear Garden. Yes, she said. Then build it, he said. She built it. Not alone, she was past the solitary mode, had been past it for over a year, had learned the particular and difficult and worth it practice of building things in rooms with other people. She built it with the audit team and with Rael and with the archivist staff and with Harwick and with Fenwick and with Ruth Caldwell, who came to the palace once, at Lyra's specific and direct invitation, and sat in the briefing room and answered questions for 4 hours with the precision of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask them. She built it across the 2nd year and into the 3rd year, which was when she stopped counting years because the project had become part of how the pack functioned, rather than a separate thing happening alongside how the pack functioned. The formal structure and the operational reality began to close their gap, not all at once, not perfectly, in the incremental, specific, occasionally failing and then correcting way that real systems change when they change for real. One morning in the 3rd year, early summer, the garden thick and green, the window open and the morning light coming in clean and warm, she was at the kitchen table with coffee, and the first documents of the day when she realized she had stopped thinking of the East Wing as the East Wing. She had stopped thinking of it as the separate entrance and the guest quarters and the practical terms she had negotiated in a forest on the night of the bonding ceremony. She had stopped thinking of it as the place she had retreated to after the briefings in the library, the place with its own door and its own kitchen and its own distance maintained by her own choice. She was thinking of it as the kitchen, her kitchen, the one with her grandmother's green fabric on the windows and the copper set on the shelf and the 2 old lamps and the table where she worked in the mornings, and the chair that had the specific comfortable quality of a chair that knows who sits in it. She was thinking of it as home. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the window. The garden beyond it was green, and the morning was warm, and somewhere in the main wing the day was beginning in the way it always began. Rael was already at his desk. Aldrich was probably running his drills in the north yard. The archivist staff was arriving and pulling their day's work from the correct files, which were now correctly filed, which had taken 2 years and was done. She heard footsteps on the garden path. Not unusual. The garden paths connected the main wing to the east wing and various people used them through the day. But these footsteps stopped at the east wing door. A knock. She got up and opened the door. Kalen was standing in the garden with his working clothes and his morning expression, which was, she had learned over 3 years, the expression of a man who had been awake for some time, and was thinking about several things at once, and was currently, also, looking at her with the particular attention that had not diminished in 3 years of daily proximity, and showed no sign of diminishing. "The Morning Courier has something from Harwick," he said. "The second clause language." "The final draft," she said. "It looks right," he said. "I wanted your read before I confirm." She stepped back from the door. He came in. He sat at the table in the chair across from hers, the one that had been the chair where the morning visitor sat since the first time she had left a working document on the table and someone had come to discuss it. He had his copy of the treaty clause. She had coffee. She poured a second cup from the pot on the stove, because the pot was always large enough for 2, because this was how the mornings worked now. This was what home looked like when you had built it yourself. She sat across from him and read the second clause language. It was good. It was clear in a way the original had never been. It described the patrol rotation's actual operational intent in plain terms that would not generate ambiguity, because the terms had been built from the bottom up, from what the patrol actually did, rather than from the formal description of what it was supposed to do. "It's right," she said. "Good," he said. She handed the document back. He set it on the table. The morning came through the window, the particular warm early summer kind, through the dark green fabric, with the light doing the thing that the light always did at this hour in this room, the thing she recognized and had come to expect, and which was, she realized, the thing she would miss if it were not there. She did not think about what the elder would say about any of this. She did not think about the noble houses or the formal royal designation, or the 30-day window that was now years in the past. She did not think about the ceremony format, or the category the pack had needed to construct, or the thing it had taken 4 months to name. She thought about the kitchen table and the second cup of coffee, and the second clause of the Western Passage Treaty, and the man across from her who had come to find her in the library, and sat on the floor and helped her sort 60-year-old documents, who had left a coat at a guard post before a ceremony and gone east when she went west, and sat in the dark and waited. She thought about all the things she had built in this place, the things that mattered and the things that lasted and the things that were still being built, and she thought, this is what choosing looks like, eventually, when you have chosen well and kept choosing. The Northwest water situation, she said. I saw Garrett's update, he said. Ruth Caldwell's arrangement is holding, she said. 3 growing seasons. The seasonal adjustment clause is working. Yes, he said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. The garden was green and warm and alive outside the window, and the morning was doing what mornings do, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed to be said that was not already present in the quality of the silence. The particular silence of 2 people who have been building something together for long enough that the building itself has become a kind of conversation. She had run from a ceremony once. She had packed 43 coins and a bag of practical clothes and memorized an escape route and turned left. She had not regretted the turn. She did not regret it now. What she had found, on the other side of it, was not what she had been escaping toward. It was not the unmapped territory and the open uncertainty and the life built entirely on her own terms, solitary and uncomplicated, and free from the weight of anyone else's expectations. What she had found was harder than that, and better than that. She had found a table big enough for 2, a door left open that she had chosen to walk through, a long, patient practice of choosing, daily, the things she had chosen on a November morning in the bare garden. The work was not finished. The work was never finished. There were supply chains to correct and treaties to rewrite, and territories full of people who knew things the formal system had not yet learned to ask for. And there were mornings and documents and conversations, and the slow, careful daily business of closing the gap between what was formally known and what was actually true. She was ready for all of it. She had been ready for a while.